also showing the piece of video which was filmed there. You can see one of the Ukrainian MPs that about the way the people were leaving the place, because there was some criticism that there were the attackers attacking the people, attacking the activists. But what we had on there, that there were the locals trying to protect the people, and also the MPs who were there just trying to protect them from being attacked.
But, you know, from what I understand, if the police had made a commitment to protecting the marchers any time earlier than the morning of the march, if they had actually negotiated with the organizers, it wouldn't have been difficult to create a safe passage corridor from the place of the march to the nearest bus stop and to make sure that everybody got on a bus.
But this is part of the issue that it came down to the wire, because it was Poroshenko in his press conference who then said that he wouldn't go himself, but he felt they should have the right, and then that's when it changed like that.
They still had time to do that, and you know, so I think I doubt that it was ill will. I think it's incompetence. Not negotiating with the organizers of a public event is police incompetence. You know? And even in Moscow, police know how to create safe passage. And we've even seen that happen with LGBT events when the police are motivated to do that. So I've seen it, I know exactly how it's done. They could have done it, and the police were endangered because they didn't negotiate with the organizers.
Well, this was a tough protest for them too.
The police were injured. I mean, the police were more seriously injured than the protesters. The people who were there on the ground, there was clearly no ill will. They were really working in good faith. If their command had organized them and had ordered them to act according to a better designed plan, there wouldn't have been the injuries.
Yeah, there we actually have this, the first video when there was this first attack, just a few seconds, and we were happily, Hromadske had been there because we arrived a bit earlier than the other journalists. So that was this small moment when people were a bit shocked that it happens, but it didn't stop. That's what we understood later.
Just to ask a basic question, there's when it comes to kind of these marches in Ukraine, but maybe not just here, there's a big misconception about what it is. Last year, when they tried to cancel Pride for the same reason, the March of Equality, there was concern that, you know, because of the war was used as the excuse. They were saying we can't provide the police and have people to protect everyone that way. And so, but my question is, people looking at it now, a lot of Europeans say, you know, this is violent, this isn't the way it should be, because in Western Europe it's developed differently. What's the history of this event? I mean, isn't violence a part of the tradition?
I wouldn't say violence is a part of the tradition. I mean, the first Pride parade was held in New York in 1970, a year after the so-called Stonewall riots. So the Stonewall riots was a moment, and you know, it wasn't the first such event, but it's sort of what in the historiography of the gay and lesbian movement in the States, it's considered the seminal event. Is when police who routinely conducted raids, and very humiliating raids, of gay bars, came to a bar called the Stonewall. And one of the humiliating parts of the raid was the police had the right to check whether, in compliance with local New York laws, the men, each person was wearing at least 3 items of gender-appropriate clothing. So they would take the men and the women separately to bathrooms, and they would have them strip and show that they were wearing, you know, gender-appropriate underwear, basically.
Oh, wow.
And at one point, the patrons of this bar refused to submit. And this was in late June 1969. It led to 3 days of street resistance. Not exactly a riot, actually, but street resistance, and it's considered the beginning of the modern gay liberation movement. And so the following year, people held a Pride parade. It wasn't parade in the sense of celebration, nor was it pride in the sense that it's often misunderstood elsewhere in the world. It was not, you know, it was pride as opposed to shame.
Right.
And that's why I stress that they refused to submit to this incredibly humiliating ritual, the humiliation at the hands of the police, which was directly related to the understanding that people should be ashamed of who they are. And so the statement that's made by the Pride parades is, we're not ashamed of who we are.
especially in public. I mean, my question there is, that initial tradition, there was a certain amount of conflict with the state, that with the police in New York having abused them, looking for bribes, some have said, and others. And what was so interesting today is that you had basically the state enabling it, the police like you saw, and then there are also members of parliament like Leshenko. There are 2 this year, I believe, who are attending.
Well, it's actually the job of the police to make sure that any public event that is legal, or even that is not legal, but that, people are not hurt. But there's nothing illegal about this event, and it's the police's job to protect the population.
Masha, the debate definitely here, which is, in Ukraine, by those who protest, I'm not speaking about this violent protester, that it's, there is a war, it's not the time, and still the issue of the LGBT community is a huge issue in the whole post-Soviet world, even in Eastern Europe. And why you claim and explain that this is something, principle, this is something as important as the other issues? Because I think these are the questions you often ask while in Russia, while here, or even probably while in elsewhere.
There are 2 really important things, I would say. One is that, Russia, which is waging war in Ukraine, has made state-sponsored homophobia a key element of its new ideology. Russia is reconstituting itself as a totalitarian society based on this ideology of so-called traditional values. And the key element of traditional values is the anti-gay campaign. And when Russians talk about war in Ukraine, they talk about fighting American homo-fascists in Ukraine. They talk about the threat of Ukraine moving westward, meaning that it will expand, now I'm quoting the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Russian parliament, that if Ukraine moves westward, it will expand the sphere of influence of gay culture, which is the official policy of the European Union. So Russia is fighting the gays in Ukraine. Now, of course, Ukraine has the option of saying, okay, well, that can be in Russia's imagination, but actually we have no gay people and that's not an issue. But the fact of the matter is it's not just Russia. The fact of the matter is that the frontier of the global fight for human rights right now is at LGBT rights. That's where, and there are very few countries in the world where it is still okay to be racist. There are very few countries in the world where it is still okay to systemically discriminate against disabled people. But there are still countries that are debating whether discrimination against LGBT people and violence against LGBT people is basically socially acceptable. And that's exactly the border between the European civilization and non-European countries that are on European territory. And Ukraine is making that choice right now. And the final thing I would say is that it's a huge mistake that's been made over and over in a lot of post-Soviet countries to say now is not the time. Actually, if not now, when? When societies are going through the active process of transformation, it's actually a very brief window of opportunity, and then it shuts down. Then people go back to life as usual. And whatever isn't changed in that short period of time, whatever agreements are not made within societies, are then put off indefinitely. We saw that happen in Russia, and the effects have been disastrous, not just for Russia, but for Ukraine as well.
You were running in Russia this very, very popular platform, Snob.ru, and there was like some fresh air to the Russian liberals, and it was a really big community. It was something, it was from a smaller, some opposition media coming to something bigger. But now these, group people who would you call liberals or whatever, it also has shrinked, and it's also a divided community in some way. What had happened that the people who were all, close to the things you say, just, they also are talking about the, Crimea hours and things like that?
I think that in the last 3 years, Russia really has transformed from an authoritarian society into a society that's becoming totalitarian. And they live in, those kinds of societies live in accordance to completely different rules. In a totalitarian society, it is a matter of survival to know exactly how the wind is blowing and to be able to parrot that line. And so people have switched to that mode of behavior. And the fact that, the polls show that maybe 14–15% of people haven't made the switch is actually pretty significant, considering that we're now living in a different world.
What is Ukraine to Russia at this point? Because we were saying this percentage has gone down, right? So one element of Ukraine is being kind of the hope for a liberal Russia. There are a lot of people who are liberals who've left Russia to go everywhere, but some to Ukraine. What is that image, and what's the image of Ukraine in general?
Well, that's the really sad part, because I think this is where the Kremlin actually meets the people who stand in opposition to the Kremlin. Neither side is capable of seeing Ukraine as a separate country. The Kremlin says, if they have a revolution, we're scared because we might actually have a revolution too. That's not true. Ukraine has been a transitional society for over 20 years. That means it has some democratic mechanisms that extreme pressure from the people has been able to turn on during both Ukrainian revolutions. That's how those revolutions have worked. They have woken up dormant democratic mechanisms. Russia has destroyed its public space. Russia has destroyed its democratic mechanisms. Russia, even if hundreds of thousands of people came out in the streets in Russia, there are no mechanisms that they could turn on. So in that sense, the fact that Ukraine has had a revolution is not a threat to the Kremlin, and it shouldn't be afraid of it. If only it were capable of seeing Ukraine as a separate country, it wouldn't be so afraid. But then you look at the people who stand in opposition to the Kremlin, and they do the same thing. They write beautiful open letters to Ukraine saying, stand up, and if you can win, we can win too. That's not true. If you can win, that doesn't mean, unfortunately, that we can win. And so both sides look at Ukraine as a mirror, but it's not a mirror. It's a separate country, and neither side can see that.
Recently, there was a case of poisoning of Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was a journalist and now running the Open Russia Foundation. And you were writing that there is a threat to much more people, yet there are those who say you're kind of overdoing that it's a bit too, I don't know, too much to say that.
Yeah. There's a kind of ethos in Russia, and it's not just in the opposition, but it's this idea that it's not cool to say that you're scared. I actually think it's not cool to act like your life doesn't matter. I think that the message from the Kremlin has been very, very clear. With the murder of Nemtsov, with what looks like, we don't know for sure, but what looks like an attempted assassination of Vladimir Kara-Murza. Neither of them has the stature of, say, Litvinenko, who was a personal enemy of Putin, who was an FSB whistleblower who was poisoned in London in 2006. These are people who really didn't threaten the Kremlin in any way. They send the message out. I mean, I'm not trying to downplay their accomplishments. I'm just saying, realistically, nothing is threatening Putin's power at this point. So the message that these attacks send to people who are opposed to Putin is, all of you are at risk. And I don't see any shame in hearing that message and saying, yeah, I know, that's scary, and I'm scared. I could be killed, and other people could be killed. I'm very lucky not to have been attacked. I get a lot of death threats, but I've never actually had anybody make an attempt on my life. And I will do everything in my power to make sure that that continues. I don't think there's any shame in taking precautions and being careful, because I would like to live.
Well, and what was that moment like for you when you chose, I mean, you took your family from Moscow to New York, right? I mean, you must also think about these security issues and just where there's hope or potential.
Yeah, I mean, it was a matter of hope. It was a very quick decision, because basically Milonov, who's the big anti-gay politician in Russia, started threatening my family directly and saying that my children should be taken out of the family. I didn't think that the threat was huge, but my oldest son is adopted. And legally, it wouldn't be difficult to take him away. It's very easy to annul an adoption in Russia, and it would be very easy to do it in a court hearing that I wasn't even present at, so I could not know that it had happened. I didn't think that our biological children were a threat. But then I thought, okay, what am I thinking? How can I even be having this conversation with myself? Because at that point, I was thinking, okay, well, so the biological children, it's conceivable that they could, the social services could take my daughter out of school, and then I would have to go rescue her, maybe call the embassy, and it could last for hours. And I thought, can I actually live in a situation where I think there's a realistic possibility that my daughter would spend hours with social services, with some stranger telling her that she shouldn't be living with her mothers? And, we packed up and left.
And how has the change been? I mean, you've made a shift, and you also had this book about the Boston bombings that just came out, which shows another connection between kind of the former Soviet space and the U.S.
Oh yeah, the topics are really endless. You know, I have lots of areas of activity. The shift has been great. It's lovely to not have to track my children's movements every step of the way. I have 2 teenagers and a toddler, and just to feel safer is huge. It's been, I mean, I'm in a very privileged position. We had the documents. I'm a U.S. citizen, and I was able to marry my partner, and so she got a green card, and we had the resources to buy a house in New York. So it was a very soft landing, and a lot of people that I know in New York, hundreds of people at this point, who have come in the last couple of years are LGBT refugees who don't have those kinds of resources, who are asylum seekers, who sleep on other people's couches and who work under the table. And still, one of the things that they say that really strike me is that they feel safer in New York than they do wherever it is they came from.
And to summarize and wrap it up, we talked shortly, and there is a lot of debate how to engage Putin, how to talk to him, how to settle down this, how the conflict, what would be the resolution. But you mentioned that it's very hard to negotiate with such a personality. It's still a lot depends on him. So
I would go further. It is not possible to negotiate with him. It is not possible to engage him. And I think at this point, the Western politicians who talk about engagement are being absolutely immoral. This man has demonstrated very clearly that he's interested in endless war. That is his sole goal. The goal of this war is not territory, it's not strategic resources. The goal of this war is war in perpetuity. He has also shown that he negotiates in bad faith always, no exceptions. He's shown that everything he says is the opposite of the truth. And so at this point, for John Kerry to go to Sochi, the cradle of the Putin civilization of traditional values.
Well, his new dream where the Olympics was. And
Exactly.
This new dream of
I mean,
Putinism.
it's like handing it to him. It is, and I'm not going to talk in Soviet, Russian terms about an American humiliation, although I think it's kind of embarrassing. But I think it's immoral, because what, in private life, we have all dealt with people who are impossible to deal with. We have all dealt with liars. We have all dealt with people who consistently deal in bad faith. And we know that continuing to try to deal with them and continuing to trust them is to betray ourselves and to corrupt ourselves. In political conversation, that should also be understood. It is corrupting for the West to pretend that engagement is constructive. Now, what happens if you admit the impossibility of dealing with Putin? I'm not exactly sure. I'm not a policymaker. My job is to criticize. But I think that any politics has to be based on the facts. The facts are he's impossible to negotiate with. And so that leaves the West not with a strategic politics, but with a moral politics, and that's what's lacking.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us.